The people who change the world are rarely the ones standing in the spotlight. They're the ones quietly giving away the little they have. Dawn had barely broken over the Romano estate when Naomi Carter slipped through the service entrance with her head lowered, her dark curls tucked beneath a simple scarf and a canvas lunch bag pressed against her side. At 27, she had mastered the art of moving unnoticed. Inside the mansion, crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors worth more than every apartment she had ever lived in combined. Outside the iron gates, another world waited, one built from cracked sidewalks, faded jackets, and empty stomachs. Naomi spent her mornings dusting rooms larger than her childhood home, polishing silver that was never touched twice, and replacing flowers before anyone noticed the old arrangements had begun to fade. She worked carefully because mistakes cost jobs, and jobs paid for her mother's medication. Every dollar mattered. Every hour mattered. Every chance mattered. The Romano estate ran with military precision, and one rule had been repeated so often it no longer sounded like advice but law. Staff were never to interact with strangers beyond the property gates. Questions created problems. Kindness created liability. Everyone understood. Everyone obeyed. Everyone except Naomi. As the kitchen staff prepared an extravagant luncheon for guests who would likely leave half their meals untouched, Naomi quietly stepped outside, carrying only the paper bag that held her own lunch. She glanced toward the security cameras, then toward the back gate where an elderly man sat on the curb wrapped in a weathered coat despite the warm summer morning. His shoulders slumped with exhaustion. His hands trembled as he stared at the sidewalk instead of the passing traffic, as though even hope required more energy than he had left. Naomi hesitated for only a heartbeat before crossing the distance between them. "Good morning," she said gently, kneeling so they were nearly eye level. The man looked up with tired gray eyes, embarrassed to be seen at all. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I wasn't asking anyone for anything." Naomi smiled with the same quiet warmth she offered every guest who walked through the mansion doors. "I know." She opened the paper bag and placed a turkey sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water, and the homemade oatmeal cookie she had baked the night before into his hands. "It's not much," she said softly, "but nobody should have to wonder where their next meal is coming from." Tears gathered in the old man's eyes before he could stop them. "Then what will you eat?" he asked. Naomi laughed so lightly it almost disappeared into the morning breeze. "I'll be okay. I've skipped lunch before." She never mentioned that she would spend the rest of the day cleaning banquet tables covered with food she could never afford. She never mentioned the growling in her own stomach. She simply stood, brushed the dust from her uniform, and wished him peace before turning back toward the mansion. She never noticed the figure standing silently on the second-floor balcony above the gardens. Dominic Romano, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit despite the early hour, had paused halfway through reading a business report the moment he noticed one of his employees walking toward the gate. He expected carelessness. He expected a violation of protocol. Instead, he watched a woman who had almost nothing willingly give away everything she had brought for herself. The estate was famous for wealth beyond imagination, yet the smallest act of generosity that morning belonged to the one person with the least to spare. Dominic lowered the report without saying a word, unable to look away as Naomi disappeared back inside, while the hungry stranger clutched the simple paper bag as though someone had just handed him back a piece of his dignity. Naomi returned to the mansion before anyone noticed she had been gone more than a few minutes, or at least she hoped they had not. She washed her hands, tied her apron a little tighter, and quietly stepped back into the endless rhythm of polishing crystal, arranging fresh flowers, and carrying trays through hallways that seemed to stretch forever. Around her, conversations drifted through the air like background music. Chefs debated imported ingredients. Assistants discussed seating charts for an exclusive dinner that evening. Gardeners hurried to replace flowers that had wilted under the summer sun. Every employee moved with urgency because the Romano estate rewarded perfection and remembered mistakes. Naomi understood that better than anyone. Losing this job was simply not an option. Her mother's prescriptions sat neatly organized in a small apartment across town, each bottle representing another week she had managed to buy through long hours and aching feet. Every Friday evening, Naomi mailed most of her paycheck before allowing herself to spend a single dollar. She had learned long ago that love often looked less like grand speeches and more like unpaid overtime, skipped meals, and quiet sacrifices nobody applauded. As she finished setting polished silver beside the dining room table, the executive housekeeper, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, approached with her usual composed expression. She was respected throughout the estate because she rarely raised her voice. She never needed to. One disappointed look from her carried more weight than shouting ever could. "Naomi," she said calmly, "walk with me." Naomi immediately sensed something was wrong. They moved through a long corridor lined with paintings older than either of them until they reached the service office. Mrs. Brooks gently closed the door before speaking again. "You know the policy regarding people outside the estate?" Naomi lowered her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Brooks folded her hands together. "The security cameras recorded you leaving the property boundary for several minutes." Naomi's heartbeat quickened. She did not search for excuses because she had none. "I am sorry," she answered honestly. The gentleman looked hungry. Mrs. Brooks remained silent for several seconds before releasing a slow breath. "This house has survived for generations because rules are followed, not because employees decide which ones matter." Naomi nodded. "I understand." "Do you?" Mrs. Brooks asked quietly. "Because kindness can carry consequences you do not expect." Naomi accepted every word without argument. She had already prepared herself for dismissal. Instead, Mrs. Brooks surprised her. "Return to work. I will report the incident later." Naomi blinked with disbelief. "Thank you, ma'am." "Do not thank me yet." Mrs. Brooks replied. "If Mr. Romano asks about this personally, I cannot protect you." Those words lingered in Naomi's mind for the rest of the afternoon. Every passing footstep made her wonder whether someone had come to escort her out. Every ringing telephone sounded like bad news waiting to arrive. Yet she continued working exactly as she always had, greeting guests with a warm smile, refilling glasses before anyone requested another drink, and quietly disappearing before compliments could reach her. High above the estate, Dominic Romano stood inside his private office overlooking the gardens. A tablet displaying the morning security footage rested on his desk, paused on the exact moment Naomi placed her lunch into the stranger's hands. He replayed the scene once, then again, and then a third time. It was not the sandwich that held his attention. It was the expression on her face. There had been no hesitation, no expectation of gratitude, and no glance toward the cameras to see whether anyone was watching. In a world where almost every favor demanded recognition, she had performed one that nobody was ever supposed to know about. Dominic slowly leaned back in his chair, pressed the intercom button, and spoke only one sentence. "Find out everything there is to know about Naomi Carter." The following morning arrived with the same quiet routine, but something invisible had changed inside the Romano estate. Naomi sensed it in the lingering glances from the security staff, in the unusual silence whenever she entered a room, and in the strange feeling that someone, somewhere, was paying closer attention than before. She refused to let it distract her. There was too much work to finish before sunset. Fresh linens had to be delivered to the guest suites. The library shelves needed dusting before an afternoon meeting. Hundreds of white roses had arrived from California, and every arrangement had to be perfect before the evening reception began. Outside, luxury vehicles rolled through the front gates one after another, carrying investors, politicians, celebrities, and executives whose watches alone could have paid her rent for years. Inside the kitchen, chefs prepared filet mignon, fresh Atlantic lobster, handmade pasta, and desserts decorated with edible gold leaf. Trays overflowed with food so carefully prepared that every plate resembled a work of art. Naomi carried several of them through the dining hall, listening as guests complimented flavors before leaving half the meals untouched. When the dinner service finally ended, untouched bread, vegetables, fruit, and perfectly good meals quietly disappeared into large disposal bins because regulations required everything to remain flawless. Naomi paused only for a second before continuing her work, but the contrast settled heavily in her heart. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had watched an elderly man struggle to accept a simple sandwich, apologizing for existing as though hunger itself were something shameful. Here, abundance disappeared without a second thought. She judged no one. She simply wished the two worlds could somehow meet. High above the ballroom, Dominic Romano stood alone inside his office. the floor-to-ceiling windows revealing both the illuminated gardens and the distant city skyline beyond. A leather folder rested open on his desk. Inside was everything his private staff had gathered about Naomi Carter during the past 24 hours. 27 years old. No criminal history. Consistently excellent employment records. No complaints from previous employers. Volunteers at a neighborhood church food pantry whenever she has a free Saturday. Sends nearly 70% of every paycheck to support her widowed mother, Eleanor Carter, who is recovering from chronic heart disease. Never requested financial assistance. Never accepted special treatment. Never spoke about her personal hardships inside the workplace. Dominic slowly turned another page. Receipts showed regular grocery purchases that exceeded what one person could reasonably consume. At first, his investigators suspected she was supporting relatives. They soon discovered something entirely different. Several small convenience store owners recognized Naomi immediately. Every week, she quietly bought extra sandwiches, bottled water, and fruit before walking through neighborhoods where homeless veterans and elderly residents often gathered. She never stayed long enough for conversation. She never allowed photographs. She simply handed people food, wished them well, and continued walking to her next job. Dominic rested his fingertips against the report without speaking. In his world, generosity usually arrived attached to publicity, influence, negotiations, or expectation. Naomi seemed unfamiliar with all of those things. Her kindness had no audience because she believed none existed. As evening settled over the estate, Dominic closed the folder and looked toward the glowing lights below, where Naomi continued arranging chairs for tomorrow as though this had been another ordinary day. He realized something that unsettled him more than any business negotiation ever had. She had spent years changing lives one quiet act at a time, and everyone around her, including himself, had been too busy looking at power to notice the quiet strength standing in plain sight. The following afternoon, the summer sun hung high above the estate as Naomi finished polishing the last of the guest rooms before quietly asking permission to leave for her 30-minute lunch break. Mrs. Brooks nodded without looking up from her clipboard. "Be back on time." Naomi smiled gratefully and hurried toward the employee entrance with the same worn canvas lunch bag she carried every day. Hidden inside was another simple meal she had prepared before sunrise. A peanut butter sandwich, 2 bananas, a bottle of water, and a small paper envelope containing $20 she had originally planned to use for bus fare and groceries after work. As she reached the back gate, she looked toward the familiar sidewalk. The elderly man was there again, sitting beneath the shade of a maple tree with his hands folded across his lap. He looked weaker than the day before, but when he noticed Naomi approaching, he forced himself to smile. "You came back," he said quietly. Naomi laughed softly. "I told you yesterday that nobody should wonder where their next meal is coming from." She handed him the paper bag, but before he could thank her, she noticed his breathing had become noticeably slower and his hands shook more than before. "Have you eaten anything since yesterday?" she asked. The man hesitated before answering. "A cup of coffee someone bought me this morning." Naomi looked down at the envelope in her hand. $20 was enough to buy her groceries for the next 2 days. It was also enough for the man to have a warm meal nearby. She did not pause long enough to debate with herself. She gently placed the folded bills into his palm. The old man immediately tried to give them back. "No, young lady. You need this more than I do." Naomi carefully closed his fingers around the money. "Today you need it more." Tears quietly formed in his eyes. "Then how will you get home?" Naomi looked toward the long road stretching beyond the estate and smiled with peaceful certainty. "It is only a little over 6 miles. I can walk." The old man lowered his head, unable to hide his emotion. "People stopped seeing me a long time ago," he whispered. "You looked at me like I still mattered." Naomi answered with a voice barely louder than the breeze moving through the trees. "You have always mattered. Sometimes people are simply carrying so much that they forget to look up." She wished him well before turning toward the estate, fully expecting another 2-hour walk home after her shift ended. She never realized another pair of eyes had witnessed everything once again. Dominic Romano stood inside the security office rather than on the balcony this time, watching the live camera feed without interruption. No one else in the room dared to speak. His head of security quietly slid another report across the desk. "She gave him her lunch again," the man said, "and the last cash she was carrying." Dominic did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the monitor until Naomi disappeared through the service entrance. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but thoughtful. Most people become generous after they become wealthy. He slowly stood from his chair. She became generous while she was still struggling to survive. For the first time in many years, Dominic postponed an important business meeting without explanation. There was suddenly something far more important he needed to understand about the quiet young woman who kept giving away everything she had while asking nothing from the world in return. Dominic did not return to his office after postponing the afternoon meeting. Instead, he quietly walked through the estate without the usual entourage that announced his presence wherever he went. Employees continued working, unaware that he was observing details he had ignored for years. He noticed Naomi carrying boxes that were clearly too heavy for one person, yet she smiled when another housekeeper apologized for being unable to help because of an injured wrist. Naomi simply assured her everything was fine and finished both assignments without complaint. Later she paused beside one of the younger gardeners, who looked frustrated after accidentally damaging a flower arrangement. Rather than criticizing him, she knelt beside the broken stems and patiently helped him rebuild the display before returning to her own responsibilities. Every small act seemed almost invisible, disappearing into the rhythm of the estate before anyone could recognize it. Dominic began to understand why no report had ever described Naomi as extraordinary. Extraordinary people rarely announce themselves. They quietly changed the atmosphere around them one conversation at a time. That evening, the estate hosted another formal reception. Elegant music drifted through the ballroom, while guests admired priceless artwork and discussed investments over expensive wine. Naomi moved through the crowd with practiced grace, collecting empty glasses before they could clutter the tables. During dinner, one distinguished guest accidentally knocked an entire glass of sparkling water across the white tablecloth. Before the man could apologize, Naomi calmly replaced the linen, reassured the embarrassed guest that everything was perfectly fine, and thanked him for his patience as though he had done her a favor instead of creating more work. Dominic watched the exchange from across the room. Not once did Naomi show irritation or exhaustion despite having worked since before sunrise. Hours later, after the final guests departed and silence slowly returned to the mansion, Dominic entered the security office once again. He requested footage from previous months instead of that day's recordings. The monitors displayed dozens of ordinary moments that no one else had considered important. Naomi carrying extra blankets to a maintenance worker caught in an unexpected rainstorm. Naomi leaving handwritten encouragement beside the locker of an employee whose father had recently become ill. Naomi quietly paying for a delivery driver's dinner after overhearing that his wallet had been stolen earlier that day. None of these actions had been reported because none had disrupted business. They had simply made difficult days a little easier for strangers. Dominic leaned forward, studying each recording with growing disbelief. One of the security officers finally broke the silence. "Sir, should we continue reviewing?" Dominic nodded without taking his eyes off the screen. "Keep going." Another recording appeared. Naomi was sweeping the front steps late one evening when a little girl visiting with her parents dropped a stuffed rabbit into a puddle. Before the child noticed, Naomi cleaned it carefully with a towel, dried it with warm air from inside the entrance, and returned it without expecting recognition. The little girl's smile lasted only a few seconds on the recording, but something about that brief moment lingered long after the video ended. Dominic slowly stood and walked toward the window overlooking the sleeping estate. Wealth had built magnificent walls around his world, yet the quiet young woman working inside them possessed something money had never been able to purchase. She carried peace wherever she went, not because life had been kind to her, but because she had chosen kindness despite life rarely being kind in return. For the first time in years, Dominic questioned whether success should be measured by everything a person owned or by every burden they quietly lifted from someone else's shoulders. Long before anyone at the Romano estate knew her name, Naomi Carter had learned that hunger could change the way a child looked at the world. She had been 9 years old when her father passed away unexpectedly, leaving her mother to raise a family with little more than determination and faith. Their small apartment on the south side of Chicago was filled with love, but love alone could not keep the refrigerator full. Naomi still remembered evenings when her mother quietly claimed she had already eaten so the children would finish the last bowl of soup without guilt. She remembered pretending not to notice because admitting the truth would only make her mother feel worse. One bitter November afternoon, after school had ended, Naomi walked home carrying an empty backpack and an even emptier stomach. The wind pushed against her thin jacket as she passed a neighborhood bakery. She stopped only because the smell of fresh bread escaped through the open door. She had no intention of asking for anything. Looking was free. Dreaming was free. As she stood outside the window, an elderly woman stepped out carrying 2 paper bags. She looked at Naomi for a long moment before smiling kindly. "Have you eaten today?" Naomi immediately shook her head. Pride arrived much earlier than adulthood, and even as a little girl she hated admitting she needed help. "I am fine," she answered softly. The woman nodded as though she understood exactly why Naomi had lied. Without another question, she placed 1 warm loaf of bread, a container of homemade soup, and 2 apples into Naomi's hands. When Naomi tried to refuse, the woman gently closed her fingers around the bag. "One day," she said with a peaceful smile, "when life becomes kinder to you, do not pay me back. Simply make sure someone else does not feel invisible." Naomi carried those words home more carefully than the food itself. Her family shared every bite that evening, and for the first time in weeks, everyone went to bed with full stomachs. The bread disappeared by morning. The memory never did. Years later, after graduating from high school and working one job after another, Naomi continued searching for the elderly woman who had changed her life. The bakery had closed. The neighbors had moved away. Nobody seemed to remember her name. Eventually, Naomi accepted that she might never find the person who had first taught her what compassion looked like. Instead of searching any longer, she chose to become the answer to someone else's difficult day. Whenever she packed lunch, she packed a little extra if she could. Whenever she received unexpected overtime pay, she quietly bought groceries for someone who needed them more. She never considered herself generous. In her heart, she was simply passing forward a promise that had been entrusted to her years earlier. Back at the estate, Dominic sat alone in the library after midnight with Naomi's file still open beside him. His investigators had uncovered every address she had ever lived at, every previous employer, every financial record they could legally obtain, yet none of those documents explained why she kept giving away what she could barely afford to keep. For the first time, Dominic realized that facts could describe a person's life without ever revealing the reason behind their heart. Somewhere in Naomi's past was a story no report could capture, and he found himself wanting to understand it more than any business deal waiting on his desk the following morning. The next morning, Dominic gave an instruction that puzzled everyone around him. "Bring the gentleman from the back gate to me," he said quietly. His head of security hesitated for only a moment before leaving the office. An hour later, the elderly stranger sat in a comfortable chair inside a private guest room overlooking the gardens. Fresh coffee rested on the table beside him, along with a warm breakfast he accepted with visible gratitude. He introduced himself as Benjamin Harris, speaking with the calm dignity of someone who had once been accustomed to being heard. Dominic noticed that Benjamin thanked every employee who entered the room, no matter how small the task. After breakfast, Dominic finally asked the question that had stayed with him since the first morning he watched Naomi through the security cameras. "How long have you known Naomi Carter?" Benjamin smiled gently. "Only 3 days." Dominic looked surprised. 3 days, and she has already given you food twice and all the cash she had in her pocket. Benjamin lowered his eyes. "Young people usually hurry past me. I do not blame them. Everyone is carrying something heavy these days." But she stopped, sat beside me, and spoke to me as though I still belonged in this world. The room became quiet. Benjamin continued after taking a slow sip of coffee. "Most people see an old homeless man." She saw a neighbor. Dominic folded his hands thoughtfully. "Tell me about yourself." Benjamin looked toward the window where sunlight rested across the gardens. "For 35 years I taught history at a public high school. I believed every student deserved someone who believed in them before they believed in themselves." He smiled faintly at the memory. "After my wife passed away, medical bills consumed my savings. Then the apartment building where I lived was sold. One setback became another, and before I understood what was happening, I was carrying my life inside one backpack." There was no bitterness in his voice, only quiet honesty. People assume anyone living on the street made terrible choices. Sometimes life simply changes faster than the heart can prepare for. Dominic listened without interrupting. Benjamin reached into his worn coat and carefully removed a folded piece of paper. It was a photograph faded by years of being carried everywhere. Dozens of smiling students surrounded a younger Benjamin inside an old classroom. "These children are adults now," he said softly. "Doctors, nurses, mechanics, teachers, parents. I hope they remember that someone once believed they could become more than their circumstances." Dominic studied the photograph for a long moment before handing it back with unusual care. As Benjamin slipped it into his pocket, he smiled again. "Do you know what surprised me most about Naomi?" Dominic quietly shook his head. "She never asked why I was homeless. She never asked whether I deserved help. She believed hunger was reason enough." Those simple words settled heavily over the room. For years, Dominic had evaluated people by reputation, history, influence, and risk before deciding whether they deserved his trust. Naomi had done none of those things. She had seen need and answered it before judgment had the chance to arrive. As Benjamin finished his breakfast, Dominic realized he was no longer investigating a housemaid. He was slowly discovering a way of seeing people that his wealth and power had never taught him. Dominic remained in the guest room long after Benjamin had finished breakfast, turning the faded classroom photograph over in his hands before carefully returning it. There was something strangely familiar about the image, not the faces themselves, but the warmth behind them. Before leaving, Benjamin smiled politely. "Thank you for the meal." Dominic looked at him for a moment before asking one final question. "If you could change one thing about your life, what would it be?" Benjamin shook his head gently. "I would not change my life. I would only hope that people remembered I was more than my worst season." Those words followed Dominic throughout the afternoon. Instead of attending another series of meetings, he instructed his assistant to retrieve archived family records stored inside the estate library. Boxes of photographs, newspaper clippings, and personal journals covered the large mahogany table. He searched without fully understanding what he was looking for until one yellowed envelope slipped from an old album. Inside was a photograph taken nearly 25 years earlier during a neighborhood literacy program his late grandmother had quietly funded every summer. Dominic studied the smiling volunteers gathered outside a small community center. Then his eyes stopped. Standing in the back row, younger but unmistakable, was Benjamin Harris. Dominic slowly turned the photograph over. His grandmother had written names beneath each face in neat blue ink. Benjamin Harris, volunteer teacher. The word struck him with unexpected force. His grandmother had often spoken about one teacher who stayed long after everyone else left, helping children who struggled with reading because he believed every child deserved patience. Dominic had been only 11 years old when he briefly attended one of those summer programs after losing both of his parents. He had almost forgotten those afternoons spent quietly reading, while an encouraging voice reminded him that difficult chapters always came before better ones. The memory returned all at once. A kind teacher placing a history book into his hands and saying, "Never let where you started decide where you finish." Dominic closed his eyes. He had carried those words through every difficult season of his life without remembering who first gave them to him. That teacher had been Benjamin. Fate had quietly completed a circle neither man had recognized. Benjamin had once offered hope to a grieving boy. Decades later, Naomi had unknowingly offered hope to the man who had once guided that same boy. Dominic stood silently before the library window as evening light settled across the estate. Wealth had convinced him that every important connection arrived through contracts, influence, or strategy. Instead, the most meaningful connection in years had been created by a housemaid carrying a paper lunch and an elderly teacher who never stopped believing in human dignity. Downstairs, Naomi continued folding fresh linens for the next day's guests, completely unaware that her simple act of compassion had uncovered a forgotten chapter of someone else's life. She believed she had merely fed a hungry stranger. She did not know she had restored a bond stretching back more than 2 decades, reminding one powerful man that the greatest debts in life were often measured not in money, but in kindness remembered across generations. The following morning, Benjamin Harris no longer sat beneath the maple tree outside the estate. The sidewalk where Naomi had met him for 3 consecutive days stood empty except for scattered leaves dancing across the pavement in the gentle breeze. As soon as her lunch break began, she carried the familiar paper bag toward the back gate with a hopeful smile that slowly faded when she realized he was nowhere in sight. She looked farther down the block, then across the street, wondering whether he had simply found another shaded place to rest. After waiting several quiet minutes, she placed the sandwich, fruit, and bottled water on the bench beneath the tree with a handwritten note tucked inside the bag. It read, "If you come back, I hope this helps. Please take care of yourself." Naomi whispered a small prayer before returning to work, believing Benjamin had simply continued his journey somewhere else. She never imagined that only a few hundred feet away he was already resting comfortably inside a private guest suite prepared especially for him. Dominic had arranged a complete medical evaluation, clean clothing, temporary housing, and every practical necessity Benjamin would need without revealing who had made the arrangements. The instructions were simple. Treat him with dignity. Ask for nothing in return. Benjamin accepted the kindness with quiet gratitude, though he remained puzzled by the sudden generosity. "Please thank whoever made this possible," he told the staff. "And tell them I hope they never lose sight of the people the world forgets." Those words were faithfully repeated to Dominic later that afternoon. Instead of responding immediately, Dominic stood beside the large office window overlooking the estate grounds. He could see Naomi below, carrying fresh flowers into the ballroom exactly as she did every day, completely unaware that the man she had worried about was finally sleeping in a comfortable bed after countless nights without one. Dominic considered telling her the truth immediately, yet something held him back. He wanted to understand whether her compassion depended upon seeing results or whether it existed simply because someone needed it. The answer arrived sooner than he expected. The next day, Naomi walked to the same bench again carrying another lunch, only to find the previous day's meal untouched except for a small bird pecking at the apple. She quietly replaced everything with fresh food and another handwritten note. "I hope you are safe wherever you are." There was no disappointment in her face, only sincere concern. She still believed Benjamin might return hungry at any moment. Watching through the security monitor, Dominic slowly shook his head in quiet disbelief. She had already given more than anyone could reasonably expect, yet she continued giving without knowing whether the recipient would ever receive another gift. There was no applause waiting for her, no recognition, no reward, only an empty bench and the possibility that someone might need a meal. Dominic finally understood that Naomi's kindness was not a reaction to gratitude. It was part of who she was. That realization changed something deep within him. Success had taught him how to build companies, negotiate impossible agreements, and protect everything under his responsibility. Naomi was teaching him something far more difficult. Real generosity asked no questions, expected no acknowledgement, and continued even when nobody was watching. Standing alone in the quiet security office, Dominic made a decision that would soon change not only Naomi's future, but the future of countless people she had never even met. 2 days later, the estate woke beneath a soft gray sky, and Naomi followed the same routine she had repeated every morning since Benjamin had disappeared. She packed another simple lunch before leaving her apartment, adding an extra orange because she remembered how his face had brightened the first time she had brought fresh fruit. As she stepped through the service entrance, she glanced toward the familiar bench beyond the back gate. It remained empty. She quietly finished her morning assignments, arranged flowers throughout the mansion, polished silver for another formal dinner, and waited patiently for her lunch break. The moment it arrived, she carried the paper bag outside once again. The maple tree swayed gently in the breeze, but Benjamin was nowhere to be seen. Naomi placed the lunch on the bench beside the previous handwritten note that someone had carefully folded and left untouched. She smiled sadly. "I hope you found somewhere warm," she whispered before turning to leave. He did. The calm voice behind her stopped her in mid-step. Naomi slowly turned around and found Dominic Romano standing several feet away, dressed in a dark tailored suit, his hands resting quietly in his pockets. There were no bodyguards surrounding him this time, no assistants, no distractions, only silence. Naomi immediately lowered her eyes. "Good afternoon, sir." Dominic looked toward the untouched lunch resting on the bench before returning his attention to her. You have been bringing food here every day. Naomi nodded. I thought he might come back. Dominic spoke gently, without the cold authority everyone at the estate had come to expect. Benjamin is safe. Naomi looked up before she could stop herself. Relief instantly filled her face. He is? Dominic nodded once. He has a clean room, regular meals, medical care, and people making sure he is comfortable. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment, as though releasing a weight she had been carrying for days. Thank God, she whispered. She did not ask where Benjamin was staying. She did not ask who had helped him. She simply smiled, and Dominic realized something remarkable. Her greatest concern had never been receiving credit for helping him. It had always been whether he was all right. After several quiet seconds, Dominic asked, You never wondered if he deserved your kindness? Naomi looked toward the empty bench before answering. Everyone deserves to eat, sir. Even strangers? He asked. She smiled softly. Especially strangers. Family usually knows when we are struggling. Strangers often suffer where nobody is looking. Dominic remained silent, absorbing every word. Why did you keep coming back after he disappeared? Naomi answered without hesitation. Because if he returned hungry and found nothing waiting for him, I would have missed the chance to help. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh roses through the gardens as both of them stood quietly beside the empty bench. Dominic had negotiated billion-dollar agreements with less certainty than the conviction he now heard in Naomi's voice. There was no performance, no attempt to impress him, only simple truth spoken by someone who had quietly lived it for years. He finally looked at her with a warmth no employee had ever seen before. Come with me after your shift ends this evening, he said. There is someone who has been hoping to thank you in person. Naomi's eyes widened with quiet surprise, but she simply nodded. Yes, sir. As Dominic walked back toward the mansion, he realized the greatest transformation had not happened to Benjamin. It had happened to himself. Somewhere between a paper lunch bag and an empty park bench, he had begun to understand that real leadership did not begin with power. It began with seeing the humanity that everyone else walked past.